This is NDTV, and you're watching NDTV Profit.
Very tough times for policymakers and business leaders around the world and in India. Hello and welcome to this very, very special discussion. We come to you from the World Economic Forum in Davos, and we will discuss India's growth, what needs to be done to fix the slowdown, and are Indian business leaders being too critical of the government? We introduce you to our special guests today, Rahul Bajaj, Adi Godrej, Jyotiraditya Scindia and Shobna Bhartiya. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Let me start by asking you, Mr. Bajaj, the last 1 year, we've seen something absolutely unprecedented. Corporate leaders standing up and talking against the government. Why are we seeing the industry being so critical? It's never happened in the past.
As you said, if it didn't happen before, because they didn't have spine before. So they found their spine. That's one. Second, they had reasons to.
Right.
Which I'm sure all the three will disagree with me. This is a different matter, what you should say and what you should not say, and self-fulfilling prophecy, and don't be negative. I agree with all that.
Right.
But on the other hand, you can't lie. You have to tell the truth, and you have to accept reality. But before I go further, I'm delighted to come to Davos, as usual, for many, many years, because everybody here is crying. We are laughing. My company has grown in the last 7-8 years by 15% or 20% every year. We make more profit than any other auto company in India.
So when we're on a global platform, we should actually feel delighted, because we're crying about growth slipping from the expected 9%
9 to 7, 7.5 maybe.
But we're still way better than the rest of the world.
Absolutely.
Mr. Satya, we know that as the minister, you have to do a very, very tough task of defending the government when the industry is actually attacking the government. We have seen government bashing being the flavor of the season. At the same time, the industry is saying, why are you telling us not to be negative when we realize that there are so many things that need to be fixed? Policy paralysis has been a real issue in the last 1 year.
Well, I don't agree with that notion, Shweta, because I think you have to see a government in its continuity. And I think if you look at the track record over the last year and a half, there has a lot of policy-making decisions that have been taken. Whether you look at the national manufacturing policy, the government, in terms of my ministry, spearheading the whole DMIDC corridor program, which is a $90 billion infrastructure program connecting Bombay and Delhi. Across the board, our annual quarterly reviews of the foreign trade policy, tweaking it to incentivize it. Right. And if you look at the numbers, whether you look at FDI numbers coming into India, which today are at close to about $22 billion, up from $14 billion for the same period, we're almost up 64%. Or even if you look at the export numbers, we've closed December at 218 billion. Hopefully, the end of this fiscal, we should close close to 300, between 280 to 300, which is still 12.5% up last year. Where in the world are you actually getting that growth? Even if you look at GDP growth, as you said, up at 7.5%, compared to the rest of the world, India is still doing better. Now, I take Rahulji's point completely, that it's not the issue of looking at us in isolation. Right. And looking at us in a contextual situation, but are we actually delivering up to expectations? Can we do better? The answer, of course, is yes. And I think that's where this is a healthy precedent, that for the first time after a long time, industry and government are actually working together to try and see what are the levers that we need to have in place to make sure that that happens.
Is the industry and the government working together, Mr. Godrej? Because the sense that we tend to get is that there is this huge trust deficit between the government and the industry, and it's a huge deficit that it's a gap that needs to be bridged almost immediately, because the industry has been very worried about the way the government has been going about a number of things.
There have been a few issues. For example, I think the rate hikes perhaps should have stopped before the last couple of rate hikes, because the inflationary expectations were already coming down.
But the government will say that's the RBI, why blame us for it?
No, sure, but I mean, we're talking of the government in its entirety, including the RBI.
Right.
The rupee was allowed to depreciate far too much.
Right.
It was almost given a free hand. Ultimately, both the government and the Reserve Bank very clearly did mention that they would like the rupee to be reasonably priced. Now today, for example, the rupee has come back up to 49.70.
Right.
So I think some of the things could have been handled better. For foreign direct investment into multi-brand retail, if introduced when Parliament was not in session, might have got through more easily.
Right.
So a few issues, but that always happens. It's very difficult for a government also to time everything perfectly, to do everything perfectly. I think after January 1st, I've seen tremendous improvement in sentiment in India. The reality was always better than the sentiment. Rahul was talking about the growth of his company. Our group as a whole has grown 30% this year.
Right, so it's
we've
not
done
as
well.
bad as we're
So the
making
reality
it out
has
to be.
been
Right.
better than the perception, and I think we are going forward in January with several good developments, and I do hope after the state elections are over, the government will act even more on certain reforms and things will accelerate upwards.
It's great that the mood is turning a little more optimistic after many months of real almost despondency that we had seen. At the same time, the concern is that coalition politics will still play a part, and even though most industry leaders are hoping that things will change after the state elections, are you equally optimistic? Are you going to see second generation reforms really taking off?
Well, I think that reforms have not come to a standstill, but I think tier 2 reforms, which should have happened, logically have not happened.
Right.
Part of it is because of politics, as you just said. Part of it is because of the entire structural issues that we face in terms of being a federal nation state, where there are many areas which are very imperative for reforms, which are on the concurrent list.
Right.
Politics will play a definite part, because you've seen many parties advocating certain reforms but opposing them when they're in the opposition for the sake of opposition.
Right.
Hypothetically, if the state elections do throw up sort of great results for the ruling coalition, I think there could be a slight shift in the sense of their dependence on some of the allies would lessen to some extent, and if they do find new allies through this process, then you could see some of the tier 2 reforms actually move forward. And I don't think it's for want of trying. You know, there are the executive decisions and the legislative decisions, and it's not for want of trying that things have not happened, but it is because of a reason beyond their control, whether it's getting held up in Parliament or whether it's executive decisions where they are not being able to carry along their allies. So I think these elections could see a turning point, but much depends on actually how well the UPA coalition does.
All right, the state elections will perhaps decide the sentiment going forward. Mr. Bajaj, it is true that politics has hurt growth in the last 1 year. How badly do you think the entire, I mean, we're still seeing a political blame game happening. The government saying the opposition did not allow reforms to go through, the opposition turning around and saying we were okay, the allies told it. So what's really happened in that last 1 year when we've seen such disruptive politics and industry leaders like you not just attacking the government, even attacking the opposition, saying let growth happen?
You see, apart from the effect on us of what's happened in Europe and America, apart from the high price of oil and commodity prices which contributed to inflation beyond the control of anybody, including the government. So all those things are there, we can't forget it. Otherwise, I agree with you. It's not a question. We are not only complaining against the government. I've been quoted more than once or twice, thrice in the last 1 month or 2 months publicly to say that government and at least a major opposition party, now everybody won't agree with this, are behaving like school children. I'm talking, Jyotirdatya does much more of that, I'm sure, but I'm talking to people, my friends, a few that I have, I don't have too many friends anywhere, but in both the parties, and they're strongly blaming the other one. Yeah. So if you listen to one party, how reasonable. Right. You hear the same thing, the other party, and I'm referring to the two main parties, BJP and Congress. So that is unfortunate. And as an outsider, it's not for me to say who's wrong and who's not, but I do say I find both need to improve. In Shobna's word, BJP should not be at least anywhere near as opportunistic as it appears to be. And I also believe that the Congress should extend their hand towards the opposition, including mainly I mean not only, also especially, because then they can get through Rajya Sabha, they can get through many things.
Right, you had a point to add, yeah.
Yeah, no, privately when you talk to them, they agree on many of the measures that need to be taken. So whether it's a GST, whether it's a direct tax code, in fact retail, it was very much part of the NDA manifesto.
Even insurance.
Insurance.
But it is.
Strangely, in insurance, the opposition is coming from within the Congress because the standing committee, which is headed by Yashwant Sinha.
How do you explain that, Mr. Scindia? How do you explain that you know, as she's telling us that, you know, privately they seem to agree that reforms is the way forward, but collectively there is no movement towards it?
Well, I think you have to look at India in its total entirety, and liberalization and reforms in India sometimes we've achieved a lot over the last 2 decades, but sometimes it doesn't move as fast as we'd want to. Now, FDI and multi-brand retail, even though we'd want to have pushed it through, it unfortunately didn't go through. We intend to build that consensus and bring it back and eventually see it through. But FDI in single brand retail has gone through.
100%.
So I think 100% has gone through. So I think it's important, and I think it's important to see what has been achieved as well. I've always maintained this, that probably in India you will not see reform to be as fast-paced as all of us would expect it to be. It's much more of a gradualist approach, but at least I think what India takes ahead as a country in terms of steps, once taken, are very, very cemented steps. And that's resulted, along with industry, and I think industry has a very, very large role to play there in terms of actually delivering tremendous amount of rates of growth. So I think government's role more and more has to be that of a facilitator, to produce an enabling environment where people such as Mr. Godrej and Mr. Bajaj can do their bit to make sure that national income and national good rises.
But why is the government so defensive then when the industry is critical? That's my question to you.
I don't think so. I really believe, Shweta, I really believe that. I don't think that industry and government are at loggerheads. I think the purpose
not
is,
at all.
the purpose
it's
is the
true
purpose.
they're not at loggerheads, but
if
what
I may just finish, the purpose
Sure.
is common.
Right.
There may be differences of opinion.
Right.
There may be discussions in terms of variance, in terms of alacrity and speed, in terms of which things happen. But I think we're all working towards a common goal, and that common goal is very clearly enunciated in what the UPA has done, which is to ensure that the private sector does what it does best,
Right.
and to allow government to plow back the revenues into social sector projects, whether it is the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, Bharat Nirman in terms of building infrastructure, the DIMI-DC corridor, extending the
my
capex
question
of the
is-
railways. So those are the sort of things that government has to do. The health sector, the education sector, and the private sector has to do the areas in which they perform the best.
Right, I will come to what the industry has not done right, but at least in terms of the government, what are we worried about? We've set ourselves back by almost 1 year by losing out on that window.
I don't agree with that.
Last 1 year,
I do not agree.
Would
Again,
you-
again,
Why do you
no,
divorce yourself from the global environment?
Yeah,
and the
I
fact
mean,
that we
there's
still-
way
don't
too
think,
much blame
you know,
on the global
Shweta, I
environment.
actually have been hearing
We
so
still
much of
clocked
this in
7%.
Davos, and I'm actually shocked. Where in the world are you getting 7%
Why
GDP
did you
growth
start
rate?
the year saying you'll do 9%? Is it all global factors?
It is, a lot of it is global factors, and maybe you set yourself up
But
to a target.
the
Let me
government
finish.
messed
Let
up
me finish.
also. I
No,
mean,
no, let me finish.
I don't know if Mr.
Shweta,
Godrej or
You are
Mr.
today
Bajaj
a
would agree.
$1.7 trillion economy.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
You're one of your fourth largest economy in the world today. It's thanks to the private sector that you're actually growing at the rate
But
that
the
you're growing.
government was
The-
overconfident. The government
No, no.
did
So,
not
so
think
therefore,
we
I
can
think, is
slow
it the role of media to be critical about if you're overconfident? Is it the role of media to be critical if you're underconfident? So where do you want the government to play out?
Mr.
Shweta, the
Godrej,
first
yes.
half of 11 went well.
Right.
Calendar year 11.
Right,
The
right.
second half didn't. Clearly, the Eurozone crisis had its effect. Clearly, the anti-corruption movement has slowed things down a little bit. That's to be expected. I look at it as short-term pain, but long-term gain.
Right, right.
And I think 2012 has started well. I think we'll do very well in 2012. And the one reform which will take us back to the 9% growth rate very
GST.
rapidly would be passing the goods and services
Yes.
tax.
Which we're
That's a
not
very
sure how
important-
building
Which
the
will not happen
consensus,
this year,
no.
which will
I
not happen
think
this year.
business-
Trinamool is opposing it.
No, no,
Right,
business
right.
association should
Right.
work with the opposition parties, with the government, to
Right.
get a consensus, to get it through.
Why is the industry not rising to the occasion? Why is the industry just criticizing the government? Why are we saying we're so dependent on the government for our economic
No,
growth?
we're not.
Before
Who's
they
saying that?
step in,
Nobody
let-
said
one
that.
second. Before they step in, let me respond to that. I don't think they're not stepping up to the plate. I think it's unfair of you to put that label on
Exactly.
them. I think industry. Thank you.
Sometimes I convince him.
You know,
He's like a younger brother to me, or a
I
nephew
think
to me.
industry is playing their part, and they are playing a very important role.
But
and I think,
then
and
you
I,
don't
and I,
like it
no,
when
and
they
I think
tell
so
you
is
that
government.
you're not doing the
No,
right
and I
thing.
think so is government. I think
Right.
it's important that actually media takes a step back and introspects of whether you want to play devil's advocate all the time. There are times when you need to say, okay, in the global context, we are doing well. January, the first 25 days of January, you've seen, one second, $2 billion in FII flows come into India. Okay, FDI numbers where all of the world is crashing, you're up 64%. Is that not a reposing of? Is that not a reposement of international confidence in India?
Shweta, two things.
Right. How do you explain that we've been the worst performing? Our currency has been the worst performing one. The markets have been the worst performing. We've had FIIs fleeing away. So yes, there are statistics that go in our favor. There are enough statistics
of FIIs coming in the first 25
enough
days.
Statistics that don't go in our favor. Also, it is.
You're talking of the calendar year 2011, which was rather bad.
Right.
Calendar year 2012 has started very good, very well.
The truth is that, many big mega projects are getting held up. Now the government and the private sector need to work together to try and see how they can overcome those issues, whether it's land acquisition issues, whether they're environmental issues. They're taking an inordinately long time. But the Prime Minister did hold a meeting just now with those who are in the energy sector, has set up a task force with somebody like the Principal Secretary at the helm of it, which shows that yes, the government is concerned, they have addressed the issue and they are aware of it. But yes, there are these structural issues which are actually causing huge delays, and these are the mega projects. These are the projects which can actually go a long way in helping and somehow creating more jobs, more employment and generating more wealth. But
I think what's really positive is that at least there is a realization that things need to move faster, because I was speaking to a lot of people in Davos, and what they in fact said, that exactly what we're hearing from government voices, like what Mr. Sindhya is saying, that we kept saying, oh, we're doing fine, 2008, we managed to escape the crisis, we have nothing to worry. It's that overconfidence that led us to miss the bus.
I think let's put it this way, let's not go so much by words.
Right.
There are a lot of semantics going on here.
Right.
Let me give you an example. On 22nd of December, a month ago, the Prime Minister had a meeting of the Council of Trade and Industry,
right,
and I was present among 13, 14 others.
When he said don't be so negative.
That's the whole problem. You guys made it. And I'm all for the press. I'm all for saying all the wrong things, because that keeps us on our toes, us and the government. So I'm not worried as far as you don't hurt the Indian economy.
That was just a small part of his larger message.
There was I don't know how many paragraphs, 15 paragraph speech, typical of the Prime Minister, very soft-spoken. So there's one small para in between which said something like that, let's work together, what we are all saying.
It was a strong statement coming from him. He said, I'm disappointed.
But the way he said it, and this was part of a big statement, but you guys only picked that up. You guys only picked that up. We are working together. We are working together because the objective, as Mr. Sindhia says, is absolute common.
It's very heartening to see that the
But I do have one feeling, and this will be controversial.
Right.
But then there's no fun if there's no controversy.
Please go ahead.
Especially from Davos. There is a perception, and this is controversial, that the government wants reform, but the party is a little bit ambivalent in the last couple of years. Keeping in mind political expediency, keeping in mind state elections, keeping in mind the coming parliamentary elections.
The government versus the party, the whole economics versus politics, if I could put it that way.
Again, this is a bogey which has been raised for the last 7 years, right? And I think the track record must speak for itself. Government and the party have spoken in one voice, whether it was FDI in multi-brand retail, whether it is other policy decisions. Now, between the government and the party, I think the UPA government and the chairperson of the UPA as well, I think there may be a speed of reforms that they may agree upon, but I don't think there is a dissonance or a divergence between government and party, because when you lay a manifesto with which you go to election, I think it's on the basis of that manifesto that you govern for the next 5 years.
All right, it looks clearly a perception issue. Right, we'll get closing comments from everybody. Yes.
It's not multi-brand and all, because that the government can frankly bring in only when there's a consensus between the government and the party. My concern is, and I'm, whether one believes that I'm as pro-poor as anybody else, may not be more, but as pro-poor. Without that, there can't be consensus, there can't be sustainable growth and development.
But
the way these populist policies, I'm talking of Marega, I'm talking of food security bill, which has just come there. Ministers in the government who privately say there's too much, do that, help the needy. But the amount of corruption and inefficiency, I mean, apart from what Rajiv Gandhi said about 16 paisa out of rupee reaching, forget that, it may be out of context, whatever it is. But we know what wastage is taking place. It may be better in one state and the worse in the other state. And this is creating a fiscal imbalance, this is creating a fiscal deficit. Give the merit subsidy. Why are you subsidizing the diesel? Small example. Diesel for a Mercedes and BMW cars. I'm just one small example.
This problem arose.
And I hope the UDI can get settled.
Because the perception was worse than the reality.
Right.
And I don't think we should allow that to happen. The perception should always be a little ahead of the reality. Whilst we must keep correcting the reality, whilst we must keep having a discourse to see that the reality improves, we should see to it, both government and industry, that the perception is a little ahead of reality. It's very important for consumer confidence.
Mr. Scindia, clearly you've been defending the government. You're trying to sell the India growth story here, and it is a story that still remains intact. But we're hoping to see more action.
Well, I think you have seen a lot of action, and you'll continue to see that. Again, going back to the comment I made earlier, it may not be the same alacrity that we may all want, but I think you'll continue to see action. And I think this government is committed to ensure a healthy trend of GDP growth rate. And I think with regard to the pro-poor policies, we cannot forget that you have to have inclusive growth in our country. You cannot have islands of prosperity. That growth has to filter down right down to the grassroots. And programs such as NREGS, which I can see in my parliamentary constituency, have yielded tremendous amount of dividend. I completely agree with Mr. Bajaj that there are issues with regard to inefficiency, number one, and corruption, number two. But I think there comes in the point that Mr. Bhartia made, which is with regard to the federal setup of our country, where you will have, in many ways, allocations made by the central government, but look at the, I don't want to make it controversial, or I should, but look at the whole issue of the scam of NRHM and UP. 4,800 crores, which have just vanished, and you've got about 1,000 ambulances sitting in a park. I mean, that's ridiculous, and that's not something that any Indian citizen should stomach, leave alone any citizen of UP.
All right, UP elections right now, that's the flavor of the season clearly, and we're going to see a lot of action picking up post-elections. Last word from you, Mrs. Bhartia.
I think the hallmark of the UPA government has been that its policies have been very inclusive, and therefore entitlements are a very natural part of the UPA government's governance. Having said that, I believe that there needs to be a certain correlation between growth and entitlements.
Right.
So I'm all for entitlements, but what happens is that when the growth slows down, but your entitlements keep going up, you're adding more and more schemes, you're layering your entitlements, there's an imbalance. What happens then? You get inflation, you have fiscal deficit, the central bank increases the rate because inflation is a very political, it's a very sensitive topic, it's politically very sensitive, and that stymies growth. So the issue today is that I'm all for the inclusive growth and the entitlement regime that we have, but
it should not come at the cost of...
there has to be a correlation. So if your growth has slowed down, I think somewhere you have to keep an eye on the deficit. I think the Prime Minister also underscored that in his address to the nation during New Year's. And I think that's a key that they need to take, and that's where people say that there's a bit of a disconnect between the party and the government, because you see the entitlements carrying on irrespective of growth.
All right, so clearly a number of issues here. Thank you so much.
Another controversial point?
It was indeed, and of course
I think one more controversial point.
Okay. Last controversial point.
He has to have the last word.
He has to have the last word. Sorry, how could we not allow Mr. Bajaj to have the last word?
No, Shobna said the UP results are important.
Right.
And Punjab and Uttarakhand also, I mean, Goa and Manipur, yes, but UP, Punjab, Uttarakhand, Punjab maybe Congress will win, Uttarakhand I don't know. UP whether it's third or fourth, whether they get 40 to 100 in between where they get. If they are nearer to 100, that's my view, not be anybody else. That will give them more confidence, that will make the coalition partners listen to them more, I mean not perfectly. That will to some extent determine presidential election, because otherwise they don't have majority on their own, so they have to see who goes along with them. And that will partly also maybe depend, controversial, whether we have a midterm toward the end of this year, winter of this year, rather than May 2014.
That's
and all this very controversial note.
And may I say in conclusion, I believe, I don't have a crystal ball, I strongly believe after the next parliament election, these things will be behind us. I don't care what the results are. I have my own views on that. But we will be doing much better.
I think
we'll be
everyone's
among the top countries
that
in the world.
We're not headed for a midterm poll right now. The government and the industry can work towards achieving much higher growth rates than what we've seen.
No, midterm only because they would come in majority of 272.
Oh, okay.
I don't say anything to do with the industry. That's what I said, linked to that now. I'm not saying they will, but I don't know. Who am I? He knows much more than me, 10 times.
Do you want to have the last word?
Well, I think that this government is certainly going to complete its full term, irrespective of the results in the 5 states. We certainly hope that we will come out with flying colors. But irrespective of that, I think it will complete its full term.
All right, at least here in Davos, we should be celebrating India's growth rates. 7%, not bad at all if we look at where the rest of the world is. With that, it's a wrap here on this very, very special discussion. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.